2,300 men died on that field in 1863. Sandra flooded it in about 4 hours. She broke the drainage berm because standing water would make a nice pond for her grandkids. What came up out of that mud over the next 3 days, bones, buttons, a wedding ring with a name still legible inside it, put her face on the floor of the United States Congress. The battlefield was hallowed ground, protected by federal law since the 1890s. Sandra Whitfield knew that. She was president of the neighboring HOA, and she'd spent years fighting preservationists over property lines and drainage rights. Nobody believed she'd actually break the law. When the first human remains surfaced in the shallows, local authorities understood this was no ordinary property dispute. It was about to become a national reckoning over a question nobody wanted to ask: who really owns the ground where American soldiers are buried? The field was called Harper's Ridge, a sloping patch of Virginia pasture that turned into a slaughterhouse on July 3, 1863. Over 2,000 Union and Confederate soldiers fell in 6 hours of brutal close-quarters fighting. The dead were buried where they dropped, some in mass grave, others wrapped in blankets and covered with just enough dirt to keep the wolves away. For over a century, the ground stayed undisturbed. The National Park Service took custody in 1934, planting white marble headstones and building a low stone wall around the sacred perimeter. Generations of schoolchildren learned to whisper at the monuments. Reenactors gathered every summer to fire blanks and honor the fallen. And then came the Ridgemore Estates Homeowners Association. Sandra Whitfield bought her farmhouse adjacent to the battlefield in 2008. She made her money in commercial real estate, strip malls, storage units, the kind of developments that make you rich but never famous. Her husband, Kenneth, was a retired colonel who'd spent 30 years in the Army Corps of Engineers. Together, they looked at the battlefield and saw not a cemetery but a water feature. Sandra's property sat uphill from the northern flank. A drainage berm, built by the Park Service in the 90s, kept seasonal runoff from washing into the low-lying sections where the heaviest fighting had occurred. Sandra hated that berm. In her view, it diverted water away from a natural swale that would, quote, make a lovely reflecting pond for the grandkids. She first petitioned the county to remove the berm in 2016. Denied. She filed a lawsuit in 2018, arguing the berm caused flooding on her property. Thrown out. She ran for HOA president in 2020 on a platform of protecting property values from federal overreach and won by a landslide. By then, Sandra's battle with the Park Service had become an obsession. She showed up at public meetings with binders full of topographic maps and amateur hydrology reports. She wrote letters to her congressman, the kind that staffers file under persistent but harmless. Nobody took her seriously. That was a catastrophic mistake. On the morning of April 17, 2022, a backhoe operator named Darrell Meeks clocked in at the Ridgemore Estates maintenance yard. Sandra had hired him the week before. She told him the berm was an illegal obstruction, that she had county approval to remove it. She did not have county approval. She had a forged letterhead and a confidence that bordered on delusion. Darrell, a guy who'd spent 30 years digging trenches and asking zero questions, fired up the backhoe and cut a 40-foot breach through the earthwork. It took 90 minutes. The water started moving before he'd even shut off the engine. Within 3 hours, 6 acres of battlefield were underwater. The reflecting pond Sandra had imagined was now a muddy lake swallowing headstones, interpretive signs, and the unmarked depressions where historians believed mass grave lay. Park Ranger Tamaz Reyes was the first to arrive. He'd been a battlefield guide for 15 years, a man who could name every regiment that fought on that ground. When he saw the waterline creeping up the base of the Pennsylvania Monument, he vomited. He told investigators later that he knew, instantly, what was about to rise out of that mud. It took less than a day for the first bones to surface. A femur, bleached white but unmistakably human, washed up against the stone wall near the old split-rail fence. Then a pelvic bone, then the rusted barrel of an 1861 Springfield rifle, its wood stock long rotted away. Park staff called the state archaeologist, a woman named Dr. Evelyn Cross, who arrived in waders and a look of absolute horror. She established a perimeter and began cataloging finds. What came up over the next 72 hours rewrote everything historians thought they knew about Harper's Ridge. First, there were the buttons, brass Union Eagle buttons, 11 of them, scattered in a cluster that suggested a uniform still wrapped around a body long dissolved. Then came a jawbone intact, with 3 teeth and a gold filling that placed the soldier's dental work somewhere in New York City. Then, on the morning of day 3, a volunteer sifting through sediment near the old cannon position felt something metallic and impossibly small. It was a wedding ring, thin gold, worn smooth on the inside from decades of use before the battle, and etched into the band, still perfectly legible after 159 years underground, were the initials EW to MC, June 1861. Dr. Cross held the ring up to the light. Her hands were shaking. She knew this was more than an archaeological find. A name hidden in that mud could identify a soldier, connect a descendant, turn a mass grave into a specific human story. What she didn't know, what no one could have known, was that this ring would travel far beyond that flooded field. It would land in a mahogany-paneled hearing room on Capitol Hill. And when it did, a United States congressman would rise from his seat, hold up a photograph of Sandra Whitfield's backhoe, and speak her name aloud into the permanent record of the American government. 3 weeks later, Dr. Evelyn Cross sat across from a forensic genealogist in a Richmond laboratory, watching as a name materialized from the mud-caked ring on the table between them. The genealogist, a wiry woman named Celia Park, who specialized in Civil War identification cases, had traced the inscription through regimental records, marriage certificates, and a single faded daguerreotype in a descendant's attic. The ring belonged to Private Elijah Whitmore of the 147th New York Infantry. He had married Mary Catherine O'Donnell in June of 1861, 2 years before he marched into the killing field at Harper's Ridge. He was 23 years old when he died, a carpenter from Oswego who had enlisted the day after Fort Sumter fell. The initials matched perfectly. Dr. Cross called the National Park Service director that night. She used words like unprecedented, irrefutable, and sacred trust. What she didn't say, what she couldn't yet know, was that Private Whitmore still had living family who had been searching for him across 6 generations. Within a week, a great-great-great-granddaughter named Catherine Whitmore Moss stood at the edge of the flooded battlefield, clutching a photograph of Elijah in his Union blues, taken on his wedding day. She was a middle school history teacher from Scranton, the kind of person who had always felt a strange pull toward the Civil War without understanding why. A genealogist had found her through a DNA database match so unlikely that the odds were calculated at 1 in 2.7 billion. She knelt in the mud where her ancestor had fallen, where his bones had been disturbed twice now, once by war and once by greed, and she wept. A local news crew captured the moment. The image went national in 6 hours. Sandra Whitfield watched the coverage from her kitchen television. She was not impressed. To her, Catherine Whitmore Moss was a prop, a convenient emotional lever that preservationists were using to manipulate public sympathy. Within 48 hours of the broadcast, Sandra's attorney, a pugnacious land-use litigator named Gerald Bickford, held a press conference on the steps of the county courthouse. He stood beside his client, who wore a tasteful navy blazer and the practiced expression of someone deeply wronged. "My client," Bickford announced, "is being scapegoated for a routine drainage maintenance operation that was improperly permitted through no fault of her own." He produced a sheaf of documents, the same forged county approval that Darrell Meeks had relied on, and brandished them at the cameras. The county has now retroactively denied these permits to avoid liability. Mrs. Whitfield is a victim of bureaucratic incompetence, not a perpetrator. He declined to take questions. The performance might have worked if Sandra hadn't already been documented. What Gerald Bickford didn't know was that a battlefield preservationist named Marcus Chen had been filing Freedom of Information Act requests for 2 years, suspicious of Sandra's motives long before the flood. He had emails, dozens of them, emails in which Sandra referred to the battlefield as a swampy eyesore that depressed her property values. emails to county commissioners demanding they drain that mosquito trap, emails to her HOA board promising that she could deliver a pond view to 12 adjacent properties, increasing their market value by an estimated $40,000 each, and the most damning email sent to her husband Kenneth 3 weeks before the breach. I found a guy who'll cut the berm for $4 grand cash, no questions, just say the word. Marcus Chen forwarded everything to the Richmond field office of the FBI. The agent who opened the file, a veteran named Patricia Okonkwo, specialized in cultural property crimes. She knew immediately that she was looking at a violation of the Archaeological Resources Protection Act, a federal felony carrying up to 2 years in prison per count. But the email about the cash payment added a new dimension: conspiracy to commit destruction of government property. She opened a preliminary investigation. A federal grand jury was convened in secret. While the legal machinery ground forward, the battlefield itself had become a national story. Every major network sent crews. CNN ran a segment titled Field of Ghosts that drew comparisons to grave robbing at Arlington. The veterans of foreign wars issued a statement calling Sandra's actions a desecration tantamount to spitting on the flag. The Sons of Union Veterans organized a volunteer watch, posting men in Civil War uniforms at the edge of the flood zone to deter any further damage. They stood there through the nights, old men with replica muskets, guarding the bones of boys who'd been dead longer than their grandfathers had been alive. And in Washington, a congressman named Thomas Hartwell was paying very close attention. Hartwell represented a district in upstate New York that included Oswego County, the hometown of Private Elijah Whitmore. He was a former Army Ranger, a Republican with a reputation for quiet, methodical legislation that rarely made headlines. But the story of a local boy, lost to history and then resurrected by a stranger's greed, stirred something personal in him. He dispatched his chief of staff to Virginia with a single instruction: find out who Sandra Whitfield really was. What the staffer uncovered stunned Hartwell's office. Sandra's real estate empire, built on a series of limited liability companies, had been involved in at least 7 separate land disputes over the past 15 years. 4 of them involved historic or environmentally protected properties. In every case, she had used the same playbook: use legal threats and paperwork technicalities to exhaust small preservation groups, then settle quietly with non-disclosure agreements. She had never faced a criminal charge. She had also never faced a dead soldier with a name and a face, and a descendant brave enough to testify before Congress. On September 14th, Catherine Whitmore Moss sat in the gallery of the House Natural Resources Committee hearing room. Beside her sat Dr. Evelyn Cross, holding a velvet-lined box containing the wedding ring. Across the table from them sat Gerald Bickford, empty chair beside him. Sandra Whitfield had been subpoenaed but declined to appear, citing her Fifth Amendment rights. The cameras rolled. Chairman Hartwell gavelled the session to order, his voice tight with controlled fury. He entered into the record the forged permits, the cash offer email, the photographs of exposed bones. He read aloud from Private Whitmore's final letter home, found in a descendant's trunk. Tell Mary I carry her ring against my heart, and if God calls me from this field, I go with her name on my lips. Then Hartwell did something rarely seen in a committee room. He stood up, walked to a large easel beside the dais, and unveiled a blown-up photograph of the backhoe cutting through the berm, Sandra Whitfield visible in the background, arms crossed, watching. He turned to the cameras. Holding her image aloft, he spoke her name 3 times into the record: Sandra Whitfield, Sandra Whitfield, Sandra Whitfield, and announced that he would personally introduce legislation to strip her of every federal benefit, every tax advantage, every legal protection that her corporate empire had ever enjoyed. He called her a grave robber in a pantsuit. And then he sat down, and the room erupted. That footage aired on C-SPAN and then exploded across social media. Within hours, the FBI director authorized Agent Okonkwo to execute search warrants at Sandra's home and all 7 of her business addresses. What they found in her husband's home office, a spiral-bound notebook labeled Harper's Ridge Timeline in her handwriting, didn't just implicate her in a crime. It revealed that she had known, for over a year, that the berm breach would disturb human remains. She had factored that into her calculus and moved forward anyway. Because in her notebook, beside the words possible bones, she had written a single sentence, makes it harder for the feds to say no to pond, they'll want to relocate grave. She had planned to use the dead as leverage. The revelation broke the dam. Kenneth Whitmore, facing his own potential charges as an accessory, retained separate counsel and began cooperating with prosecutors. He turned over every document, every calendar entry, every recording of phone conversations he had made secretly after realizing his wife was spiraling out of control. Among them was a recording of Sandra, just after the flood, saying, "Those bones are 100 years old, Ken. Who's actually going to care? The Park Service should thank me for digging up their museum pieces." The audio would later be played in open court, over the sound of Catherine Whitmore Moss sobbing in the front row. That trial was still months away, but on that September afternoon, as the House committee adjourned and the FBI vans pulled into her driveway, Sandra Whitfield finally understood something she had refused to accept her entire life, that the dead have more defenders than the living ever expect, and that a name, once spoken aloud by a member of Congress, can never be unsaid. The search of Sandra Whitfield's home took 11 hours. FBI agents spread across her property like archaeologists on a dig, cataloging evidence, with the same meticulous care Dr. Cross had used on the battlefield. In the master bedroom closet, behind a rack of designer dresses, still bearing Neiman Marcus tags, they found a fireproof safe the size of a dormitory refrigerator. Inside were not jewels or bearer bonds, but something far more incriminating, a complete set of binders documenting every property dispute Sandra had ever initiated. Each binder had a label: Miller Wetlands 2011, Carlton Ridge 2014, Harper's Ridge 2020, and beneath the labels, in the same handwriting that had written possible bones in her timeline notebook, a notation on the Harper's Ridge binder read simply, "Will require grave relocation. Use public pressure." Agent Okonkwo opened the Carlton Ridge binder first. Carlton Ridge was a small Revolutionary War skirmish site in North Carolina, federally protected since 1986. In 2014, a mysterious drainage failure had flooded the interpretive trail, washing out a section of earth that contained remains of colonial militia members. The developer who subsequently purchased the degraded land at auction for pennies on the dollar was an LLC registered in Delaware. The managing member, buried under 3 shell companies, was Sandra Whitfield. The pattern was identical, deliberate, and years old. This wasn't a one-time lapse in judgment. It was a business model. Okonkwo made a call to the U.S. Attorney for the Eastern District of Virginia, a former JAG officer named Rebecca Okonkwo, no relation, though the coincidence of names had become a running joke in the office. Rebecca reviewed the evidence overnight. By morning, she had drafted a 17-count indictment charging Sandra Whitfield with conspiracy to commit destruction of government property, violations of the Archaeological Resources Protection Act, wire fraud for the forged permits, and most significantly, a charge under the Native American Grave Protection and Repatriation Act, extended by precedent to cover historic military burials on federal land. The last charge carried a potential sentence of 10 years. If convicted on all counts, Sandra Whitfield faced more prison time than some drug traffickers. Sandra's husband Kenneth, now a cooperating witness, provided prosecutors with the final puzzle piece. In a recorded interview conducted in a sterile FBI conference room, he described how Sandra had attended a 2019 developers conference in Phoenix where a speaker had joked, and Kenneth stressed that word, joked, about the untapped potential of historic battlefields adjacent to residential developments. The speaker had called them zombie properties, land that looked worthless but could yield fortunes if you were willing to deal with a few skeletons. Literal skeletons. Sandra had laughed at the joke. Then she had taken 6 pages of notes. The trial began on March 2nd. Sandra Whitfield arrived at the federal courthouse in Richmond wearing an orange jumpsuit. The judge had denied bail, citing flight risk after prosecutors revealed she had transferred $2 million to an account in the Cayman Islands the day before the FBI raids. Her attorney, Gerald Bickford, had been replaced by a high-profile defense team from Washington, D.C., the kind of firm that bills $1,000 an hour and specializes in making federal charges evaporate through technicalities and aggressive jury selection. They argued that the flood was an accident, that the forged permits were a clerical error committed by a low-level contractor, that Sandra had no knowledge of the berm's historic significance, and that the possible bones notation referred to a speculative conversation with a landscape architect about potential construction obstacles. In short, they argued that Sandra Whitfield was a victim of overzealous prosecutors and media hysteria. The jury listened. But then the prosecution called Catherine Whitmore Moss. She took the stand in a simple black dress, the wedding ring of her ancestor on a chain around her neck. The prosecutor asked her to describe what she felt when she first saw the flooded battlefield. Catherine sat in silence for nearly 30 seconds, the courtroom so still you could hear the fluorescent lights humming. Then she spoke, her voice clear and unwavering. She described her grandfather, a Navy veteran who had spent his retirement searching for Elijah's grave, writing letters to archives, visiting battlefields, dying in 2016 without ever knowing where his great-great-grandfather had fallen. She described the guilt she carried for not finishing his search. And then she described kneeling in the mud where Elijah's bones had been scattered, pressing her hand into the earth, and feeling something hard, a uniform button, she later learned, push back against her palm, as if her ancestor was reaching up to say, "I am here." The jury foreman, a retired Marine Corps gunnery sergeant, openly wept. Gerald Bickford's replacement cross-examined for exactly 4 minutes before sitting down. There are some witnesses you cannot attack without destroying yourself. The prosecution's forensic accountant took the stand next and walked the jury through Sandra's financial history. Over 12 years, she had acquired more than 200 acres of land adjacent to historic sites, always through shell companies, always after a convenient environmental disaster, a fire, a flood, a sudden zoning change had depressed the property values. The Carlton Ridge purchase netted her $3.7 million in profit after she sold the land to a commercial developer. The Harper's Ridge plan, outlined in a spreadsheet recovered from her laptop, projected earnings of $11 million if she could acquire the battlefield itself after the flood. She had already drafted a purchase offer, ready to submit the moment the Park Service declared the land irreparably damaged and too expensive to restore. The spreadsheet had a column labeled Cleanup Costs. Under it, a single line, Grav equals NPS problem. The defense tried to pivot. They called character witnesses, neighbors who described Sandra as a devoted grandmother, a generous HOA president who baked casseroles for new families. They called an expert hydrologist who testified, under aggressive cross-examination, that the berm's age and poor maintenance made a breach inevitable regardless of Sandra's actions. The expert's testimony collapsed when the prosecution produced a 2018 Army Corps of Engineers inspection report, commissioned by Sandra's own husband, that rated the berm structurally sound with a projected 50-year lifespan. Sandra's face moved through a series of micro-expressions as the report was read aloud, shock, then fury, then a mask of blank composure so complete that one juror later described it as looking at a mannequin. But the kill shot came from an unexpected source. On the 7th day of trial, a woman named Margaret Holloway walked into the FBI field office in Charlotte, North Carolina, with a cardboard box and a story. She was the daughter of the landscape architect who had designed the Ridgemore Estates drainage plan. Her father had died of cancer 4 months earlier. As she cleaned out his office, she found a folder labeled Whitfield Confidential. Inside were emails between Sandra and the architect discussing, explicitly, the likelihood that the berm breach would expose human remains. In one email dated October 2019, Sandra wrote, "The more skeletons, the better, makes the Park Service look incompetent. They'll want to wash their hands of the whole thing." In another, the architect expressed ethical concerns. Sandra's reply was 3 words, "Stay in your lane." Margaret Holloway handed the folder to the FBI. Her father, she explained, had been a man of deep faith who never forgave himself for the work he did on that property. He kept the emails, she believed, as an insurance policy against his own soul. The prosecution entered them into evidence on day 8. Sandra's defense team requested a recess. They did not come back with questions. Gerald Bickford's replacement, a man who had won acquittals for 2 Fortune 500 CEOs, stood before the judge and made the quietest admission of defeat in modern courtroom history. "Your Honor, the defense rests." It took the jury 4 hours to deliberate. On March 15th, at 4:47 in the afternoon, the foreman stood and delivered the verdict. Guilty on all 17 counts. Sandra Whitfield did not react. She stared straight ahead at the judge's bench, her expression the same blank mask, as if the proceedings were happening to someone else entirely. The judge scheduled sentencing for April 3rd and remanded her into federal custody immediately. As the bailiffs led her away, she passed within 3 feet of Catherine Whitmore Moss. For a fraction of a second, their eyes met. Catherine later said she saw nothing in Sandra's face, no remorse, no anger, not even recognition, just emptiness. But the story wasn't over. The judge's sentencing memorandum, when it arrived, contained a revelation that no one had anticipated. In the course of preparing her pre-sentence report, federal investigators had discovered that Sandra Whitfield's real estate network had been actively scouting 12 additional Civil War and Revolutionary War sites along the eastern seaboard. Their internal naming convention referred to them as Phase 2 through Phase 13. Each had a detailed timeline, a projected profit margin, and a risk assessment that weighed legal exposure against potential returns. Sandra had already hired backhoe operators for 3 of them. The discovery triggered a nationwide review by the Department of the Interior, which ultimately found that more than 40 protected battlefields were vulnerable to similar attacks. Congressman Hartwell, reading the Interior Department's report on the House floor, called it a map of planned desecration that reads like Sherman's March in reverse. That map, and the legislation Hartwell introduced to criminalize the deliberate destruction of military grave sites with mandatory minimum sentences, became the lasting monument of this whole ordeal. But for the families who loved the battlefield, the descendants, the park rangers, the reenactors who had stood guard through those cold spring nights, the real reckoning was simpler and deeper. They had learned that the ground beneath their feet held not just bones but stories, and that defending those stories sometimes required staring down a backhoe with nothing more than candlelight and conviction. The ring that started it all, was returned to Catherine Whitmore Moss. She wears it still. And when she teaches her 8th grade history class about the Battle of Harper's Ridge, she slides it off her chain and passes it around the room. So the kids can hold it. So they can feel the weight of a promise made in 1861 and honored, against all odds, in a flooded Virginia field, in a Richmond courtroom, and on the floor of the United States Congress. The sentencing hearing for Sandra Whitfield took place on a morning so clear and cold that frost clung to the courthouse windows. Judge Angela Ramirez, the same judge who had presided over trial, read her statement for 45 minutes. She called Sandra's crimes a calculated war against the nation's memory, waged for profit, without a shred of remorse. She noted that under federal sentencing guidelines, the archaeological protection charges alone could justify decades. But she also acknowledged something unusual. The victim impact statements submitted to the court numbered more than 200. They came from descendants of soldiers buried at Harper's Ridge, from military historians, from the sons of Union veterans and the daughters of the Confederacy, setting aside old divisions to stand together. One letter was written in crayon by a 4th grade class in Oswego, New York, who had adopted Private Elijah Whitmore as their class project. They asked the judge to make Sandra write a 1,000-page report on why she was wrong. Judge Ramirez sentenced Sandra to 11 years in federal prison, followed by 5 years of supervised release. She was ordered to pay restitution of $4.8 million, not to the government, but to a newly established Harper's Ridge Restoration Trust, to be administered jointly by the National Park Service and a board of descendants. The trust would fund battlefield restoration, a permanent archaeological monitoring program, and educational outreach. All 7 of Sandra's shell corporations were dissolved. The Ridgemore Estates HOA, now under entirely new leadership, voted unanimously to donate a 50-foot buffer zone to the Park Service in perpetuity. The reflecting pond was never built. In its place, a low granite monument now marks the spot where the berm was breached, inscribed with a single phrase, "Here, the dead rose to testify." But the consequences rippled outward in ways no one could have predicted. The nationwide review triggered by Sandra's list of Phase 2 through Phase 13 targets uncovered something alarming. At least 11 other developers had used similar tactics: environmental sabotage, forged permits, shell company purchases, to acquire or degrade historic sites. The Department of the Interior launched Operation Hallowed Ground, a task force that by year's end had opened 37 criminal investigations and recovered more than 2,000 looted artifacts. 2 developers in Georgia surrendered to federal marshals before dawn on the same morning, their coordinated arrests sending shock waves through a real estate industry that had long assumed no one was watching. Congressman Hartwell's legislation, the Military Grave Protection Act, passed the House with 392 votes in favor and only 14 against. The Senate approved it by unanimous consent. The President signed it into law on July 3rd, the anniversary of the battle, in a ceremony attended by Catherine Whitmore Moss and Dr. Evelyn Cross. The bill made it a federal felony, with mandatory minimum sentences to knowingly damage, disturb, or compromise any military grave site on federal land. It also created a national database of battlefield burials, funded by fines imposed on violators. Sandra Whitfield, inmate number 47,821-047, watched the signing ceremony on a prison television in Alderson, West Virginia. She reportedly turned away before the president finished speaking. For the battlefield itself, the healing came slowly. The floodwaters receded within weeks, but the damage to the soil, the stratigraphic layers that archaeologists rely on to date artifacts, was permanent. Dr. Cross and her team spent 2 years sifting through the disturbed sediment, recovering what they could. In the end, they identified the remains of 17 individuals. 6 were identified by name through DNA matches with living descendants. 11 remain unknown, though their bones were reinterred with full military honors in a new cemetery plot overlooking the field. The reinterment ceremony drew 4,000 people. A horse-drawn caisson carried the first coffin, draped in a 34-star flag hand-sewn by a descendant's quilting circle. Rifle teams fired 3 volleys. A bugler played taps, the notes floating out over the same ridgeline where those men had heard the rebel yell and the roar of cannon fire. Catherine Whitmore Moss received Elijah's ring back permanently after the trial ended. She had it resized and now wears it on her right hand every day. She still teaches 8th grade history in Scranton, though she no longer needs the textbook's photograph of Harper's Ridge. She has her own. On the anniversary of the flood each year, she brings her students to Virginia. They stand at the new monument, and she tells them about the carpenter from Oswego who carried a promise into battle. She tells them about the woman who tried to wash him away, and she tells them about the congressman who spoke his name into history. The students always ask the same question: what happened to the lady who did it? Catherine points toward the Appalachian foothills in the distance, toward the federal prison where Sandra Whitfield will remain until she is 72 years old. But here is the detail that even Catherine didn't learn until recently: the final surprise that Dr. Cross's team uncovered during their last excavation season, 2 years after the trial. Beneath a collapsed section of the old stone wall, in a pocket of soil that the flood had somehow bypassed, they found a second ring, smaller than Elijah's, less ornate, with an inscription worn almost to illegibility. Under laboratory examination, the words resolved: EW from MC 1861. The match to the first ring. Mary Catherine's token to her husband, the one he promised to carry against his heart. It had been separated from his body by the violence of the battle, buried inches deeper, preserved by a stone that fell at precisely the right angle a century and a half ago. The two rings now sit together in a glass case at the Harper's Ridge Visitor Center, united at last in a place where the fighting has finally stopped. So here is what the story leaves us with. A woman who believed she could erase history with a backhoe. A soldier who refused to disappear. A descendant who carried his name into a courtroom. And a government that for once chose memory over money. But the deeper question, the one this whole saga forces us to confront, is harder. How many more battlefields lie unprotected? How many developers are still running the same playbook, hoping no one finds the bones? And what do we owe the dead, not just in memory, but in law and land and vigilance? Maybe you have walked past an old cemetery on the edge of town, a field with a faded historical marker, and wondered if anyone is still watching over those graves. Maybe you have seen a developer's sign go up on land you knew was sacred. Sandra Whitfield learned the hard way that the dead have long memories, and the living who defend them are more stubborn than she ever imagined. But this story is not just about one battlefield or one woman's greed. It is about a quiet war happening right now in almost every state, between those who see land as a commodity and those who know it as hallowed ground. Operation Hallowed Ground is still open, dozens of investigations are still unfolding, and every new case begins the same way, with someone paying attention. So here is my question for you. Have you ever seen a piece of history threatened by development or a local landmark bulldozed overnight without warning? Have you ever stood in a place where you knew something precious was about to be lost, and you did not know who to call? Drop your story in the comments below. I read every single one. These comments have become a living archive of communities fighting back, and your experience might be the spark that saves another battlefield, another cemetery, another piece of who we are. If this story reminded you that the past is never really past, and that ordinary people can take on the machine and win, hit that subscribe button right now. We are building something here, a community of people who understand that receipts matter, evidence matters, and that history is not a passive inheritance, but an active fight. Next time, I am bringing you the story of a county librarian in Tennessee who discovered that a mining company was quietly removing Civil War artifacts from public land. When the county refused to act, she found a law from 1872 that made the company's entire operation illegal. They called her a nuisance. She called a federal judge. And when the dust settled, the mining company paid $12 million in restitution, and she went back to shelving books. Until then, remember what Private Elijah Whitmore's ring taught us: the smallest piece of evidence can topple an empire. Keep your receipts, all of them.